Welcome to Carbon Conversations, a podcast by Biochar Life, where we explore the cutting edge of environmental solutions, from biochar to smart agriculture to the climate tech revolution. We sit down with experts and business leaders at the forefront of change. This is your host, Matt Rickard. Hey Alain, good morning. Welcome to the podcast. How are you doing?
Matt, very good, and really pleased to be here today.
Yeah, cool. Well, Happy New Year, first of all. We're 2 weeks in. It feels like a month in already. And I know you and I tried to get this done last year. We were both busy, so yeah, it's good to get you on. But yeah, how's the new year been so far? You back into everything? Forgotten Christmas and everything?
Yeah, Christmas feels 4 or 5 months away. Very much well into 2026, and off to a good start. But it's going to be a busy one.
Cool. Well, good to hear. Well, look, we're here to chat about data centers, AI, the impact of AI on data centers, something that's fascinating to anyone really in the industry. And actually, I think the wider general public. It's slightly different to maybe some of the podcasts I've done previously, but also very topical, with the work we're doing in carbon removal. Maybe as a good starting point, you've had a long career in sustainability, energy management. What led you into the data center world, and what are you seeing there? How have you seen that kind of landscape evolve since you got into it?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Yeah, I've been in corporate sustainability for quite some time. It's all the way from studies through to across my whole career, and I worked generally in the past with sectors that are quite close to some of the resource challenges that we deal with in society. And I'd say that data centers are in a pretty interesting space because they have a very big resource discussion. They use a lot of water, they use a lot of energy. But I guess what makes them quite interesting is that they're also at a point where they can define how the sector moves forward. They don't really have the legacy of how things worked, and they also have the ambition to do things differently and really sort of ramp up the dial on, how we run infrastructure in a sense. So for me, it's a fascinating space. I think not even talking about the potential of what the data center produces, but just running the operation has a lot of sort of challenges and opportunities that I find it quite fascinating.
Cool. I mean, AI workloads are exploding. I was doing a bit of research. In fact, I wasn't even doing research. I've just seen things popping up on my feed on LinkedIn and stuff. And when I then kind of dug further, I think there's like $1 billion US data center in Thailand that's planned with Google. There's even more infrastructure in India as well. From the perspective of Singtel and the work you guys are doing, how do you approach the challenge of, AI infrastructure from a sustainability point of view when you're building these data centers? I know that's a very wide question. There's a lot in there, but yeah, I'd love to dig into some of that.
Yeah, happy to give a bit of a view on how we're thinking about it. And we have a general framework, and really it's going to start with where we're actually looking to put the data center, both in terms of sense of the actual operation, but both also in terms of considering the sustainability challenges. So both in terms of impact and reliance on resources, we need to think about, does this place make sense? Once you've buttoned in that, then we're going to talk about the construction process. So we need to do this using as green materials as possible. And as a sector, DCs generally have been pushing quite hard on utilizing green construction materials, thinking about embodied carbon, all of that, while also practicing, good things on the ground. So I think once you've tackled all that piece, we've got the data center up. It's really going to be around sort of two key dimensions. I see one is how do we design and run a completely optimized piece of infrastructure. So we talk about terms like PUE, basically looking at the water utilization and the power utilization and how we maximize how much IT load effectively we can generate out of the power and water that we're utilizing. So really running as efficient equipment as possible and process, thinking about how we use AI in that context to maximize it, to get really sort of a highly functioning infrastructure setup. So that is normally where we spend a lot of our time. And the other big chunk is how we actually are finding resources. So water, energy, etc. Where's this coming from? Is it sustainable? How are we contributing to those key resources in the region to make sure that we are having a positive impact and also running sort of a highly sustainable piece of infrastructure. Another piece I won't really go into is really around how do you actually use the data center and the sustainability impact of that. But it's something we definitely consider, because it's not just about running sustainable infrastructure, it's about using it for the right reason. So those are really some of the key things we think of. There's a few other things spattered around it, but those would be some of the main topics we dive into.
I know, Singapore's data center moratorium and sustainability push that have been hot topics, and maybe you kind of touched on some of it there. But what are the key kind of hurdles and opportunities when you look at building green data centers in Singapore?
Yeah, Singapore is a really interesting context from a data center perspective. Round about the time I arrived in Singapore, I think it was in 2019, a moratorium came in, which basically restricted the sort of free building of data centers. It's not a true moratorium in a sense, because effectively what they've been doing is running a process where you can bid to win capacity to build a new data center. And we had our first round a couple of years ago. Second round will kick off quite soon. So very much in this sort of heat of the sort of approval process. But I'd say that why I find it so interesting is that there's a lot of places around the world that obviously haven't followed that, and they've found themselves in a situation where certain resources do get into a situation where we have problems. So one that jumps to mind, I mean, if you look at Ireland, I hear a huge percentage, maybe up to 20% of the electricity is used by data centers. And,
wow.
that can have interesting impacts on your grid system if you're not prepared for that. So I think what Singapore is doing is saying, let's restrict this, let's allow data centers to come in a well thought out manner, and ensuring that the ones that do come online are driving the right things to make sure that we don't have these unintended consequences in a sense, and that we are deploying AI effectively.
So Singapore's interesting because, I would say arguably it's seen as the kind of innovation hub within the region, at least of Southeast Asia, but it's also very small geographically. So there are grid limitations. I mean, how do you tackle those kind of grid limitations when you think about, what you need to run a data center, and what is the reality of the renewable element in terms of, the renewable integration into those data centers?
Yeah, no, definitely. And Singapore also has very ambitious targets around decarbonizing the energy system. And I'd say that there's a lot of ways to do it. It's just pros and cons across the board. And I think it's very much about sustainability, and it's very much about energy security. And we need to think of those hand in hand. A perfect green solution might not be the best from a risk perspective, and vice versa. So I think Singapore has a few angles they can take, and one that has been explored for some time is really connecting Singapore with the region from a cabling perspective. So looking at subsea cables to make sure that Singapore can take green electrons from the region, and really sort of creating this ASEAN grid system that has been spoken about for some time. I guess interesting development there is there's energy from Laos that has been sort of restarted again. I think there was a big announcement yesterday to say it can reflow into Singapore. So taking energy from the region and having this sort of connected grid system makes sense. But at the same time, as I say, we've got to think about resilience. So on that basis, today we utilize natural gas for most of our energy. And we need to find something that can fit the similar model. So looking at alternatives to natural gas that can still run in our GenCos. So we're thinking, things like biomethane, hydrogen, ammonia, etc., that could also be a part of the mainstay energy system going forward. But these are all sort of very new, emerging energy technologies that are incredibly expensive. And I think government does see data centers playing a big role in mobilizing this from the demand side.
What as you're talking through that, I'm just thinking about, I suppose, the evolution of data centers in the last, say, 20 years. A data center 20 years ago presumably is very different to a data center you're going to contract and build today. Is there a lot of kind of refurbing of old data centers? I mean, is there a whole kind of renewal of the systems and replacements, or is it kind of pretty much level and rebuild? Is it that much different, the technology? What's the kind of I suppose, pathway with companies that already have those data centers that are expanding and renewing and bringing up to date?
Yeah, I think, look, it's always about whenever you have a data center, it's continuous improvements. So if you look at our data centers each year, we have to improve the energy and water efficiency as we go. But you do get to a point, a data center design many years ago will have its limitations in terms of keeping up with the expectations by regulators and also keeping up with just, industry norms. So it does get to a point where you need to consider actually taking down your existing data centers, maybe consolidating and coming back with a renewed piece of infrastructure. So that is something that even Singtel we've done, and other organizations will look to do the same. And I think as regulators in the region start to actually put caps on things like PUE, on your energy efficiency, that will lead to a situation where companies will have to consider, taking down data centers, rebuilding, reconstructing, deploying new technology within the system.
I know you're involved in updating the GHG protocol standards. I just make sure I get that right, because this is something I'm not well versed on. But that's the correct terminology, right? So do you want to kind of share what these are and how they contribute to the landscape, transparency, consistency in the sector?
Yes, the GHG protocol, for anyone that hasn't dealt too much with the standard, effectively it's the largest emissions accounting standard in the world. It is really the backbone for most of the decarbonization initiatives that you'll come across. So everything from SBTI through to a lot of regulations from RE100, etc. They look to this as the sort of foundation standard. And a lot of the GHG protocol guidance and standards, it hasn't been updated for a very long time. And, some of it over 20 years ago was the last update. And the world has changed a lot. And we do need a revised way of looking at things. So I'm involved in a technical working group that focuses on Scope 2 emissions, so mostly electricity-related topics and how that leads to emissions. And we're looking to revise the way that the standard was put out before. Actually, at this point in time, there's a public consultation underway. It ends at the end of January. It was extended, and anyone who's working in the space really recommend that you do put your feedback in, because the proposed changes are quite significant, not just from an accounting perspective, but also the impact that it's going to have on sort of real world energy systems is really crucial. And I think we need people around the world to give their views. I think, it might be beneficial in some contexts and challenging in others. So I think that feedback is super important so that it can be taken on board. But really the direction of change is really ramping up the granularity. So, today a company might be using energy that's very unmatched in terms of how they actually are consuming. So solar that was produced last year could be used for their energy consumption today, but the shift has changes to bring it to very granular regional usage, as well as try to actually get this all the way down to an hourly matching basis of when energy is produced versus when you're actually using it. And I think this is quite important when you think of data centers, because if you talk about the most sort of common renewable energy source, a solar panel, its sort of energy production looks like a bit of a curve, where a data center, generally it's flat energy consumption across the day, the night, etc. It's quite flat. So if we want to deploy this large energy hungry sector in a green manner, we've got to think about that actual profile and how that matches. And what comes with it is a rethink on the technologies we're deploying. So do we put extra investment into batteries, look at other alternative fuels, etc. So that's really the context there. So please, anyone that is working in the energy space or in the emission space, have a look at some of the information that's been put out and give your feedback, because it is a very crucial period.
Cool. Well, I've got a couple more questions, but with that, what I will do is if you leave me a link or relevant information, I'll make sure for anyone watching or listening, it's in the speaker notes, so we can put it there and point them in the right direction. So, slightly sideways move. Wanted to ask about carbon removal. Interestingly, late last night, I had an email out of London for a buyer looking for, a couple of hundred credits to offset a data center, actually, or obviously not offset the whole data center, but part of it. So, which was very coincidental, and they were looking for spot credits and then maybe a 3 to 5 year contract, I think it was. And just a couple of hundred credits, but it was interesting and probably a good segue into asking you about just kind of partnerships and carbon markets. How do you see, I suppose, the relationship between organizations like myself, data centers, Singtel? Is there a role for carbon removal in accelerating decarbonization or bridging up the gap, the small piece that's left after you've kind of done everything you can from a technology point of view?
I do think it's a combination of the things you mentioned. I'd say that, look, as a data center, being direct on it, I think our first step is get as close to the utility side of things as possible. So make sure that you're working with the energy players and are bringing that whole piece together and greening that. But a lot of the novel energy sources we're talking about may not be 100% green or low carbon or zero carbon. I think there's always some residual. On top of that, it's very difficult to get your entire data center to zero carbon with green energy. So I think carbon reduction using offsets, etc., is very crucial in terms of how we actually sort of get to a fully decarbonized asset. I think it's quite difficult to start. So definitely a role to play there. And I do acknowledge as well that a lot of players are looking beyond just scope 1 and 2, and we need to think about everything together. And data centers will have a really significant scope 3 profile as well. A lot of embodied carbon, a lot of things going on. There's waste considerations. So to be completely carbon free as an asset, we need carbon offsets. We need solid, high quality projects that we can tap into.
You prompt another question there. I mean, when you look at a data center, where this maybe not a simple answer actually, but where does the responsibility lie when you look at the scope 1, 2, and 3? Because interestingly, you've got a big company here that's using AI. You've got the data center that's chewing up all the energy that is responsible. Is there a clear division of responsibility when it comes to that environmental impact of that process, or is that something still being deliberated and argued of who owes what?
Yeah, I'd say that it's actually quite murky. Good point to call out. And going back to the GHG protocol, if you actually look at that standard there, it's also not that clear in terms of a data center who actually owns a co-location data center, who actually owns the emissions from the electricity. Basically, the way I interpret it is the guidance they give is to say work together, find a solution. So it's a little bit murky, but I think at the same time, coming back to that guidance, practical thing is, just work together and find out what each partner is doing within the system and collaborate on decarbonizing. I think, if I look at the type of players we work with in our data centers, I think everyone is very eager to drive decarbonization and will put a foot forward in that. I think that's really the situation. It's about collaboration and getting facts on the table. I think the worst thing that any company can do is just assume the other party is taking care of things, because that's where we find a situation where there's emissions that no one's taking care of. And
for sure.
That's the problem. Yeah.
So I mean, when you look at the reality of a net zero data center, very difficult today, but I mean, if you kind of cast your vision, I don't know, 5 years, maybe longer forward, what does it look like? What needs to happen to make that a reality?
Yeah. I think I would like to call out as well that net zero can mean very different things. It's the degree of, getting to zero emissions is great. That's what we should be striving for. And I think everybody's pushing for that. But I would say as a private infrastructure, player, you got to think about what impact are you having on the wider system. So, I could buy renewable energy and say that I'm zero emissions, but did that procurement, did that whole effort actually contribute to decarbonizing the whole of the host country that we're operating in? Did it reduce global emissions? Did it actually raise the costs of everyone else living in that country by, sort of taking control of a short supply of resources? So I think it's about getting to net zero, but it's also about thinking how you additionally contributing in a positive way and not just commoditizing and taking care of the commodity under your ownership in a sense. So I think that's sort of the layer I'm calling out. And I think also with the revisions of the GHG protocol, there'll be different shapes of net zero. I mean, today I mentioned you can use the annual matching. If they start to shift towards hourly matching, you might find a lot of companies that are zero emissions today actually still have a big hurdle in front of them. But then again, so getting to that as well as driving positive impacts would be the sort of end goal in my mind.
Cool, definitely. I mean, it's. I think you've certainly got a lot of challenges, but it's an interesting space to be in. That's for sure. Certainly with everything that's happening with AI at the moment, and over the next 5 to 10 years. So, I didn't necessarily have any other questions. However, is there anything I haven't asked? I suppose that you'd like to kind of give feedback on, or anything that would be good to share still.
Yeah, I'd say that we've spoken a lot about energy and carbon. Big discussions in the data center space also go into water, it goes into biodiversity, and that whole nexus with climate and energy all coming together is a tricky one. And a lot of the countries we're looking at it's all about trade-offs and finding the best solution under all those topics together, rather than just thinking about carbon and energy on its own. And I alluded to the community impact zone as well. I think that layer is going to come in for anyone operating in a country, whether you're a data center or whatever sector. But think about, through your way of reducing your impact, also what is the positives you're having on those around you. But yeah, I'd say that we're in an interesting space. We're looking at novel energy technologies that have a different impact on biodiversity and water that we need to think about as well, and do this in a very sort of curated way to find the best solutions.
Cool. Well, look, Alan, I mean, apart from the questions, please, where can people learn more about yourself? Do you want to just leave, I don't know, details of the organization or your LinkedIn profile where people can kind of get hold of you, learn more? And I'll put those, links in the notes as well.
Yeah, happy to. I'm a little bit quiet online, but LinkedIn is probably my sort of go-to space where I do share some thoughts. Happy to share about the GHG protocol. Always open to jump on a call just to share what's my opinion on how things are shaping out, because I'll say that it's not a straightforward process. There's a lot of diverging views. You'll see it all over LinkedIn. A lot of people sort of advocating for different angles of how we think about energy going forward. So always open for a chat. Happy to collaborate with players in the space, and also keen to hear about new technologies coming up and how we can work together.
Cool. Well, look, I really appreciate you giving some time. I know you're busy, so yeah, like I say, Happy New Year. All the best for the rest of this year, and let's keep in touch.
Thanks, Matt. Been a great discussion, and keep in touch.
Cheers, Alain.
Cheers.